Hey everybody, here we are at the end of the semester, final exams, uh, right around the corner, and had some people emailing me more or less panicky. Some folks seem to have woken up in the last week or two and realized that they're maybe not in the best of shape grade wise. Some folks have asked me to allow them to do things that I just can't allow them to do. That being said, I do want you to be in the best position possible for success in the final. I know this has been a crazy semester, so what I'm going to do here is just kind of give you a rundown of what you should be prepared for on the final. I know I've already got a study guide, but this will kind of help maybe narrow down your last minute preparations as you get ready to take the final. So um, first of all, I did something I don't usually do, which is more or less keep the questions in order in terms of what lecture they come from, so that when you open the exam and you begin with question one, you'll be answering questions from the progressivism and imperialism lecture. You should definitely be able to define progressivism or the progressive movement, either as I did in lecture or as they do in the textbook. And maybe give an example or two, of who were the progressives that we talked about. Who were these people, from what walks of life, what occupations, etc.? What were their concerns? Um, Also, from that lecture, we talked about the swing away from a laissez-faire policy and what that means, and towards a more regulatory state. You should be able to identify what were the government regulatory agencies that we talked about that are created during that progressive era. And then from imperialism, I had already asked you in the quiz about banana republics, so I kind of veered towards the end of that lecture. Instead, we talked about America's war with Spain over Cuba. You should know what are the results of that war for the United States, and how does that help the United States become an imperialist nation. Great War lecture, we talked about how does America get directly involved. First of all, how was America indirectly involved in the Great War? But then what is it that leads the United States into actually joining the Allied powers and actually participating as a combatant in that war? What were the things that led to that shift in opinion that saw America actually enter the war, when you had President and Wilson who had campaigned on keeping America out of the war? And then the peace, the Treaty of Versailles and the other treaties that were signed with the defeated Central Powers. You need to know what are the results of those treaties and what were the terms imposed in those treaties that ended the war. And in terms of the American home front, we talked about the alien, or not, excuse me, scratch that. Scratch that entirely. We talked about the Espionage and Sedition Act and how that was challenged in court. You should know what did Congress put into that act, what was that act, and what does the Supreme Court have to say about its constitutionality. And of course, what were the actions of Charles Schenck, and also we talked about Eugene Debs. We also talked about the Red Scare. You need to know what that is, why it happened, and what were the different elements of it. Transitioning more fully into the 20s lecture, we talked about the Great Migration. You need to be able to define that, identify that, and I guess its consequences. And then with the coming of the Great Depression, I went out of my way to insist that it's not as simple as stock market crash in 1929, Great Depression, more complicated than that. You should be able to tell me how it's more complicated than that. What happens besides or in addition to rather, the stock market crash in 1929? What was that economic downward spiral that I talked about? What all did that include? And that would cover, of course, causes of the depression. You should also be able to identify or talk about the consequences. I threw some numbers at you, and the numbers themselves are not necessarily important, but what's important is what happens with those different macroeconomic indicators that I talked about. New Deal, you should be able to describe, thoroughly, at least, a couple, two New Deal programs, not just list them out, but be able to say, this is what this program did. This is what it was, intended to help alleviate or to fix, relief, recovery, reform. Where did it fall under those three? These were the different parameters of it. Here's its significance, and so on. You should be able to do that with not just one, but two New Deal programs of your choosing, though. And be familiar also with the things that come out of the latter New Deal's second New Deal. We talked about Social Security, but also the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. You should be familiar with those. World War II lecture. I know I asked you this on the quiz, at least I think I did, but I'm going to ask it again. I want you to be able to define fascism and give me not just one or two, but the major elements of fascism, and not just a list, but be able to explain, what those are, what those mean. In terms of the war itself, we talked about, obviously, how does America get involved? But there's a little bit of prelude to that with Blitzkrieg and the success of the Nazi German armies. And then we also talked about the Battle of Britain, the war with the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. And then Lend-Lease, of course. You should be able to identify the different aspects of Lend-Lease, or who was the United States assisting with, who was part of that program. And then end of the war, we talked about in both the Pacific and Europe, firebombing. You should be able to explain what is firebombing and who firebombed whom and to what effect. 1950s lecture, the kitchen debate. You should be able to talk about that. Nixon and Khrushchev, what's at stake there, what's being discussed, what's the significance of it, what did it have to do with my kind of theme or thesis from that lecture, which was to talk about America and the suburban ideal. And obviously America as a consumer culture. Talked about the Beats and the Beat generation, be able to tell me who they are and how they're significant vis-a-vis the same, that is the suburban ideal and American consumer culture. Cold War, you should be able to identify broadly, as in other words, why was it a Cold War? What does it mean to call the conflict between America and the Soviet Union a Cold War in the first place? What are the various elements of that? Obviously, you need to be able to define the containment policy. But two, you need to be able to talk about various proxy wars that I looked at, and before that also the Marshall Plan. I'm going to have to pause here, I got a visitor.